Welcome to The Conversation. My name is Brendan Malone, and in this episode, I want to talk about the Derek Chauvin trial, and in particular, the things that I find troubling about it. Let me just start by saying that today's episode is not about questioning the guilt or the innocence of Derek Chauvin. This is not about dismantling the verdict or trying to reinforce and reaffirm the verdict. That's not what this episode is about. So if you've come here today looking for either of those things, I'm sorry, that's not the camp I'm actually in. This episode is about other things surrounding the verdict. I personally think that there is a really strong, insurmountable case for Derek Chauvin being guilty of manslaughter here. It seems to me that the way that George Floyd was treated lacked humanity, regardless of what had led up to that moment and the moments, his final moments, and what else was happening. It seems to me that there was a lack of humanity, a lack of basic regard for his human dignity, and it seems that there is a reasonable case from experts that this did contribute, even if it's not the sole factor, this does contribute to his death, and so it seems to me that that's a pretty strong case for manslaughter. But that's just my personal opinion. I wasn't on the jury. I wasn't in that courtroom. I didn't hear all of the expert testimonies and witness and everything else. I'm just making what is really an opinion, I guess a best guessed typed opinion of the outcome based on what I've seen in the media, based on listening to excerpts from the trial video footage and from legal experts who have provided commentary on this trial. But as I said, that's really irrelevant because A, that's not what today's video is about, and B, I'm really not as well informed as the people who sat on that jury. None of us are. But what I guess I have concerns about regarding this trial is the fact that justice isn't just about the outcome. Justice isn't just about the outcome of a trial. Justice is also about the process, about the way and the motivation for that particular outcome. And that's where I have concerns, because it seems to me that this trial was surrounded by a very vociferous mob mentality that was calling for a guilty verdict well before the trial had even started. And not just calling for that, but it seems pretty clear to me that at the very least you'd have to say veiled threats were made about what would happen if that guilty verdict was not delivered. And that is troubling because, as I said, justice, good moral justice, isn't just about the outcome, it's about the way we get to that outcome and about the reason for that outcome being delivered. In this case, it seems to me there is a very real risk that possibly the ends could have justified the means, and that is troubling. This has some pretty big implications because true justice isn't simply about the end justifies the means. True justice is about the process itself that gets you to the outcome also being ethical and safe and sound. And that's the thing that worries me in this particular case. There were people, as I said, right from the very beginning who were claiming that not only was this man guilty, but that we didn't even need to have a trial. I saw a meme floating around, an absolutely absurd meme, claiming that the fact that Derek Chauvin actually had a fair trial was proof that America was a failed state. That is absolute nonsense. You see, the exact opposite happens in a failed state. In a failed state, you have mob justice, you have no fairness, you have no balance, you have no ethical due process. They just grab you and they punish you regardless. And they do that based solely on accusation. That is what mob justice looks like. That is what a failed state looks like. So the fact that he actually was granted a fair trial is proof of the exact opposite of what people were claiming who have claimed that he should have never actually had a trial. It's not just that, though. We had even elected officials, very senior elected officials, who were outside that courtroom making what could be easily construed as not so veiled threats about what would happen if a guilty verdict was not delivered. And the jurors must must have at the very least considered that possibility. These are people who live in this community, and these are people who are coming to that trial each day in a courtroom which must have felt like a military compound because of all the security that was required surrounding that trial. And they must have been aware of what could happen if a guilty verdict is delivered, or even if there was a hung jury. It must have played on their minds. They were not sequestered. There were media attempts to effectively dox the jurors and publicly name them. All of these things are a factor. And if you're a juror on that jury, there must have been at least some people sitting there thinking to themselves, well, not only could my community be in the gun for really violent criminal rioting, but also my family and my life could be in danger if we don't deliver the outcome they want. Now, I'm not saying that that's what's happened here, because it's quite possible that they were able to put all of that aside, but it seems to me no doubt that is a very real issue here. The judge himself even referenced this sort of interference, if you like, with the verdict before the verdict is delivered. So that in itself is pretty serious. The fact that the judge has seen this is clear indication that this is a real threat and a real issue that surrounded this trial. Now, what does this mean, and why does this matter? Well, it seems to me that there probably will be an appeal. I've heard legal experts who have talked about the verdict and who've talked about the trial, and they say that they believe that there are really good grounds to appeal based on process here. And if that's the case, and the appeal courts find that in actual fact the jury was wrong to deliver this verdict because the process was unsafe, what happens at that point? It seems to me that could be an even worse outcome than if the jury had followed due process. And as I said, this is assuming that maybe that didn't happen, but if they had followed due process first time around. Not just that, but if due process hasn't been followed, this is really sort of the end justifies the means, might makes right, the mob decide what the outcome will be, then what does it mean for any future trials of this nature? What does it mean when you have a situation where you have a mob of people who are really trying to use the courts as a way to solve very serious social ills that ultimately the courts are just not capable of solving? And so you don't end up with proper due process. You don't end up with fair and just and ethical justice. You just end up with the outcome that is desired by the majority of people. And those two things are not always are good outcomes to achieve, by the way. They're not always consistent with each other. In fact, quite often, mob justice is the exact opposite of authentic justice. So it's really, really important, I think. This matters a lot. And it doesn't just have implications for court-related matters. It seems to me that it also has implications for, I guess, policing in America and how police will view themselves and whether or not it will be safe to be a police officer anymore because of the risks if the courts aren't actually following due process. Even if you just feel that that's the possibility, will a lot of good men and women withdraw from the police force and we end up with a police force that is even less competent, and so more issues result and more harm is done, and it's most likely going to be in those black communities where the crime rates will skyrocket as a result of these kinds of things. We already know from recent research that as a result of the Black Lives Matter protests, there's a correlation at least between an increased crime rate in those areas where the rioting took place and compared to other areas where they didn't have rioting. So there's really big implications in all of this, and that's why I would argue that ethical justice and an ethical due process really, really matters. There's one other thing that I think is interesting about this verdict that is really worthy of our consideration, I believe. I think this verdict and this outcome really does cast serious doubt, once again, because it's not the only thing. There's actually a growing list of very public incidents, and events and happenings which I think really challenge this theory that a lot of people are promoting out there of the fact that America and the West in general is a culture of white supremacy and white privilege. Because it seems to me that if there really was a culture of white supremacy and white privilege, then your courts, your legal system is going to be affected by that, and it is actually not going to be colorblind. It is going to be supremacist in nature as well. It is going to privilege those who are white and disadvantage those who are not white, and it's going to do that consistently. So in a case like this, it seems to me that if there really was a culture of widespread racial supremacy, of white supremacy and white privilege, and that was the dominant factor, and that was the dominant force in a culture, then I doubt this case would have even got to trial. It seems to me that that culture of white supremacy, that culture of white privilege would have looked at this and said, okay, white police officer in the process of arresting a suspect who is alleged to be engaging in criminal activity and is high on drugs at the time. The police officer doesn't draw a gun and shoot at the suspect. They don't pull their batons out and beat him to death. So therefore, they would probably try and justify this, it seems to me. They would say, well, it was just an unhappy fault, an undesired tragedy that came about in the process of police doing their job. And it seems that's what a white supremacist culture, that's what a culture of white privilege would have done, surely. They would have looked to excuse it, to justify that. It wouldn't have got before the courts. It seems to me that the media in the majority would have tried to excuse it and justify, and they would have been on the side of Derek Chauvin. The general public would have been on the side of Derek Chauvin. They would have downplayed it. They would have justified it. That's assuming that it even got to trial. And if it did get to trial, it seems to me that they wouldn't have been able to secure a guilty verdict. But the complete opposite to all of that happened in this case. There was pronouncements of guilt being made by very loud and a very vocal and very large, I would argue, majority of people were calling for his guilt before the trial had even happened. The media were absolutely not on his side, and it's clear there was a direction that the media felt this should go in by and large. There's no way they were justifying what had happened here, the outcome of the trial. All of this points to the fact that in actual fact, we're not really living in a culture of white supremacy or white privilege. Now, even if the verdict in this trial was unsound because people were afraid of a mob, that still means that that mob, the controlling factor, the controlling force here in society, is not a group of people who are white and who have a culture of white supremacist sort of attitudes and beliefs that actually shield and give them special privilege. It means that they aren't actually the most powerful voice at all. So this case is yet another example, I think, that really challenges the theory of racial supremacy, of white privilege. And that's a whole nother video, which I'm going to talk about in another episode of the conversation. But I think it's important to consider that in the bigger social context and the way in which now critical theory and cultural Marxism would want us to believe that we are living in a culture of white supremacy and that the system is absolutely always going to fail those who are not white. Well, this case really does prove that that isn't the case. But some people have still tried to keep that mythology alive. Why are they doing that? Well, I think it suits their own political agenda. I think for some people it's a sort of quasi-religious belief, critical theory, cultural Marxism. They view the world through this lens to such a degree that they just can't accept that in actual fact their quasi-religious beliefs about reality, about society, about culture, and the way in which we relate with each other from our different communities, they can't get their head around the fact that their view is not actually true. And so in a case like this, they have to perpetuate the myth. I think there are others, high-profile people, who it suits their political agenda. In fact, some politicians who are pushing this narrative still after the case, this really strong narrative of racial division and tribalism and divisiveness, they have a vested interest in that. It suits their own political agenda, because without it, what would they actually have as a platform to gain or to keep political power? At the end of the day, this whole situation is extremely tragic. There's just no doubting that. A man is dead, and this whole situation has led to, I think, an even further entrenching of a very hostile tribalism, particularly within America. But I don't see this as actually being a path to healing. Regardless of whether or not this was a sound jury verdict, this is really not, I would argue, how you get healing for major social issues. You don't resolve these issues through the courts. In actual fact, I think what you need is a wider society where a strong culture of virtue is present, where a strong culture of family life and personal and social responsibility is present in citizens. And that doesn't happen by accident, and it's really hard to achieve that in a culture of moral relativism and radical individualism, which is what we have embraced as our ideological preference of choice in the West. I think what we ultimately need is a transcendent good that we look to outside of ourselves and which calls us to a life of virtue and which calls us to a life of authentic mercy and charity towards the other. Only then can we actually start to resolve serious social issues in a meaningful way. In the meantime, I think court cases like this, and this one in particular, will just be another along that journey of continued tribalism and entrenched, almost sort of ideological and possibly spilling over into other types of violence and warfare as well, which is extremely troubling and concerning. I guess at the end of the day, as a man of faith, I'm going to say that we should be praying for all of those involved in this situation, and that we should continue to pray and to work for peace and mercy in our societies. Thanks for watching this episode of The Conversation. Don't forget to like, share, and give this video a thumbs up. That all helps the channel. And wherever you're watching, please subscribe. If you're on YouTube, don't forget to hit the little notifications bell as well. That way you'll get updated about every new piece of content that we publish. A huge thank you to everyone who is supporting us at patreon.com/leftfootmedia. For as little as $1 a month, you can help to ensure that this great content keeps happening. So that's patreon.com/leftfootmedia, as little as $1 a month or as much as you'd like to contribute. And a huge thank you, as I said, to everyone who made today's episode possible. You guys are awesome. I'll see you next time on The Conversation.